That would be just our luck as we do this online event. So, this morning we got a great lay of the land of what are some of the challenges and opportunities taking place on Nantucket as it relates to materials waste. We had a really inspiring discussion with Nathaniel Green, hearing about what we could be doing with solar and electric vehicles. And I'm going to go out. I'm not going to buy a moke, but I was excited to hear about the electric F-150 and power your house from a truck. So all kinds of exciting and interesting things I'd never even considered. This afternoon, we're going to be switching over to hearing what's happening far from our shores in some places that are further along in dealing with this issue of construction and demolition waste. And our first speaker this afternoon is Shawn Wood. Shawn is the construction specialist of the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. That's Portland, Oregon. Shawn's work involves finding ways to reduce material waste associated with the construction and demolition of buildings. And I think when I first heard about what was going on in Portland, Oregon, I emailed all these news stories to like everyone I knew out here. And I said, I can't believe what's going on. This is so exciting. We just are seeing so much waste happening here on Nantucket, and I'm excited to turn it over to you, Shawn.
Great, thank you. Good morning. Well, good morning. Afternoon to probably most of you. It's morning here on the West Coast. So yeah, I'm Shawn Wood, and I'm from the future, and the only reason I say that is because earlier Mary was saying that there's other jurisdictions that are doing stuff. So I'm from the future, and I've got great messages to bring back to you all. And I actually went through while I was listening to Christiana's presentation and made some last minute changes to my presentation. So forgive any flow issues or really ugly slides because I just threw them in at the last minute to address some of the things that came up. Right, let's see. Need to advance. But first, let's go back to the past for a little bit. In Oregon, we used to have these amazing old growth forests, and you can see here the scale of a tree that was cut down by all these fellows, and that little dog there in the left side of the image. And that's what we used to build our houses out of, was this old growth lumber. That lower right image is a 2x4 that came out of one of the houses in Portland. And there's 100 years of growth rings in that 2x4. So it's beautiful, amazing stuff that typically just got smashed and either burned or landfilled. And prior to 2016, this is how we took down houses in Portland. Large excavator comes in, smashes the house, crunches up the material even finer so that it can go into the back of a dump truck or a drop box. So that they can minimize the number of trips, and then it arrives by law at a sorting facility where some poor person has to go through and sort through and try and pull out recyclables before it goes to the landfill. So you can imagine when stuff's pulverized and mixed and really dirty, there's not much of a recycling recovery rate and pretty much zero reuse recovery. And after 2016, this is how we take down most of our houses in Portland. So this is deconstruction. It's done by hand. It's kind of surgery. They do it in the opposite order the house was built. So they start at the top and work their way down and salvage materials for reuse. So here in Portland, again, these houses are made out of old growth lumber, and there's a market for that. And that's what is a big driver behind the success of this. And so I'll tell a little story about how this got started, and we'll progress to where we are today. So around 2013 or so, we'd come out of the Great Recession, and a colleague of mine at our regional government and then a local executive director of a nonprofit salvage yard and deconstruction arm met, and we were talking about ways to get more deconstruction, because right at that point there was just a handful of houses that were coming down using deconstruction, and we had 2 whole house contractors at the time. So we started talking about that, and the executive director of the nonprofit said, I'm seeing a lot of demolitions happening around town, and it seems like more than typical. So again, this was 2013, and so I went back and started checking permit numbers, and sure enough, after the recession, we were experiencing a really steep increase in the number of demolitions. And so that was followed by folks in the community that saw this happening in their neighborhoods. So they'd go to work one day, they'd come home, and the house next door was in a pile of rubble or just completely gone. And so there were concerns about lead dust, asbestos, material waste, embodied energy that was lost. There was concerns about the replacement of what was going up and not having the character of what used to be there or even the scale. And so these are actual demonstrations of neighbors in neighborhoods upset about this. And there's that one picture in the lower right there that kind of the amazing thing you would think is that goat on top of the minivan. But if you look a little closer on top of that dormer, there's somebody chained to the roof of that old house to try and prevent it from being demolished. So we went from chaining ourselves to trees to chaining ourselves to houses, because that's where the old growth lumber is today. And these neighborhoods started to get organized and mobilized, and like literally printed up yard signs that were all over town. They started a website that was, here's another house that's coming down, here's the developer, here's what's going up in its place, and here's how long it's been in our neighborhood. And then they also started to hold like demolition forums, and I was invited to a couple of those to talk about deconstruction and the advantages. And long story short, that developed a pretty strong, partnership of trying to figure out how we could, either A, curb demolitions, or B, if they do need to come down, can we do it in a better way, like deconstruction. And in 2014, our Historic Landmarks Commission came out with a State of the City Preservation report that they delivered to City Council. And in that, they raised the issue of the increasing number of demolitions, and I've highlighted it here. They called it something of an epidemic of demolitions. And who would have known that the words epidemic and pandemic would have been so much a part of our vocabulary now. And they went on further in that report to suggest that the city should look at deconstruction as an alternative to mechanical demolition. So I threw this slide in just a couple minutes ago after hearing Christiana's presentation, because the issue of demolition delay came up. And Portland had a demolition delay of 35 days, which it sounds like Nantucket has a 30-day. 35 is really the bare minimum, just because our neighborhood associations meet monthly. So depending on when they were notified of a demolition, if you had 30 days, it might not sync up with their meeting, and they literally wouldn't be able to comment on a removal of a house. So anyway, we have always had a 35-day delay, but it had this giant loophole in it that you could get around the 35-day delay. So you could get your permit same day to demolish a house. That giant loophole and the increasing concern around demolitions led to a stakeholder group at the city that was meant to recommend changes to the demolition delay and other parts of the demo process. And I more or less invited myself to those meetings and essentially started lobbying for a longer delay for mechanical demolitions, and then a shorter delay for deconstruction. And so that was really our first foray into how do we embed deconstruction into our building or zoning code. And so this started in 2014. In 2015, that culminated in our city council making changes to our demo delay. They closed the loophole, and they tabled deconstruction for that particular hearing. But this is when there should be like music playing in the background. they directed our Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, to convene a group of stakeholders and come back within 3 months to recommend ways to advance deconstruction in Portland. So we had direction from our city council, and that was huge. That was kind of what we were waiting for. So we convened a group, Deconstruction Advisory Group, or the DAG, in April of 2015. And I was really proud of this group. We had a really diverse group of stakeholders. So building developers, demo contractors, folks from the neighborhoods, historic preservation advocates, some kind of like permit, watchdogs kind of thing, salvage and deconstruction outfits, both for and nonprofit, permitting staff, and then regional and county representatives. And so this was our think tank, and we had 3 months to get to city council with a recommendation on what we were going to do about demolitions and smashing houses. And we came up with a multi-phased approach to deconstruction. So there were folks on one end of the spectrum that were like, no, let's just require deconstruction for everything coming out of the gate. And then there were other folks on the group that said, no, let's just keep it voluntary and have maybe some incentives. And so the happy medium was, let's start off with a voluntary program so we could have a grant program. And then following that, we would look at requirements for deconstruction that could be phased in over time. And so that's, this chart would not have been possible back in 2015 because we didn't know exactly what we were going to do. But this is a snapshot essentially from today, where we started with grants. They actually overlapped our requirement to deconstruct houses built in 1916 or earlier, and that played out for about 3 years. And then in 2020, we raised that year built threshold to 1940, so we captured even more houses. And I'll talk a little bit more about the thinking behind those years in a minute. So by September 2015, we had implemented our grant program. So we had $50,000 that the City Council allowed us to use for the funding of the project. And that was in the form of our solid waste and recycling fund surplus. So there was a kind of like a surplus budget, and we had $50,000 to play around with. And then that was followed up by another grant from our State Department of Environmental Quality that allowed us to add even more money to that grant incentive program and fund more projects. So for deconstruction projects, we would grant anywhere between $2,500 and $3,000 per project. And that could go to the builder, that could go to the deconstruction contractor, it could go to the owner of the project. It was just meant to essentially help offset any additional costs associated with deconstruction. And I would say at the time that $3,000 did not cover the delta between mechanical and deconstruction. So, but it was a start. And so we paid people, $3,000 to deconstruct a house. And what we got in return, which is really priceless, is a lot of information. So for any of the grants, we required them to let us know what the total cost was. If there were bids for mechanical demolition, what were those costs? What they salvaged, receipts for materials that they sold or donated, the Dropbox tickets, so we knew the weight of what was disposed or recycled, and then an inventory of all the lumber that they salvaged. And so we were able to start building a database of sorts of information, so that when we went back out to try and pass an ordinance that would require deconstruction, we had information in our back pocket that we could share with folks. And ultimately, we awarded 25 grants for the program, and it was great, to start kind of warming up the giant deconstruction machine, and then two, it was a great proving ground for some elements that we had in our grant program that ultimately went into our requirements, so our deconstruction ordinance. So the forms that they filled out on the front end of the project and on the back end of the project, we find those in our ordinance now. And then we require signage on site. That image in the lower right is a similar sign to what we have today whenever there's a required deconstruction. And of course, maintaining the receipts and submitting those at the end of the project. The other good thing about the grant program, I'll go back to this slide, is that it overlapped when we initiated our requirement that you had to deconstruct houses if they were built in 1916 or earlier, or if they were historic. And so the availability of those grants really helped answer the question of, hey, this is going to cost me. I really don't want to do this. Well, there's money available, so you can apply for a grant to help offset that. And then two, for new deconstruction contractors that ended up coming online as a result of the ordinance, they could apply for a grant, and it really helped as a buffer so that they would, you're bidding on something that you've never bid on before, so it was a little bit of a safety net to take some of the edge off of that if you ended up kind of underbidding and not having enough money to cover your costs. So it was just by chance that we had additional money left in that grant program that allowed it to run concurrently with the first year or so of the ordinance. So this is a pie chart of kind of demolition permits, and our 1916 year-built threshold was really selected. I mean, at the time, we were, it was 2016, so it had a ring to it that it was a 100-year-old structure or older that we were talking about requiring deconstruction. But more importantly, that 1916 date represented a third of house demolitions consistently on an annual basis. So if we looked at 2013 or 2012, the percentage of demo permits that fell into that age bracket, so late 1800s to 1916, represented a third of demo permits, and that was kind of the key that got us consensus in our advisory group. So we're not talking about requiring deconstruction for everything, just a subset. And so builders, when you're demoing a house, maybe a third of them might require deconstruction. And deconstruction contractors, if you were to have additional houses that you needed to take down on an annual basis, could you ramp up to meet that? And then deconstruction, or rather salvage yards, if you had an increase in the amount of material, could you handle that and be able to move it? Because there's a risk if you require too much deconstruction, you're going to have too many materials, and it's the value of that material that helps offset the additional labor costs associated with deconstruction. And then when we went with that original ordinance, part of the resolution for it was, we were going to set the year-built threshold at 1916, but within 3 years we wanted to increase it to 1940. So as long as the market was able to keep up with the supply and our contractors could do the work in a timely fashion, we wanted to really try to increase that to 1940. And by going to 1940, it essentially captures another third. And again, that's pretty predictable from year to year. And this is just kind of nerding out a little bit here. The orange bars are demolition permits. So each year, so earlier I showed you demolition permits, that line graph that showed it kind of troughing during the recession, and then in 2016 is actually when it peaked. And for no reason related to deconstruction, the demo permits on an annual basis started to go down. So that was a general cooling off of the development market in Portland and had nothing to do with requiring deconstruction. So we didn't, even though maybe some folks were hoping that requiring deconstruction might curb demolitions, when we look at new house permits, commercial demolitions, remodels, new construction, they all started to trend down in 2016 and 2017. But what's interesting here is the green line is the number of deconstructions we had a year. So in 2016, we implemented our ordinance in October, so there was just a little bit left of 2016. And some people got their permits in the door, their demo permits in the door before October 31st, so they would not have to deconstruct. So in that first full year in 2017, we don't quite reach that 1/3 that we would have expected. And part of that is due to the fact that in 2016 we got some permits in early that beat the clock. 2018, we're not, nobody got it in 2 years early. And so we see it right around 1/3. And then in 2019, in terms of deconstructions, we reached 42%. So we haven't done anything code-wise to mess around with that. But here's where the difference comes. So 9% of that 42% were voluntary deconstructions. So they could have mechanically demolished the house, but instead chose deconstruction. And that's important because at that point, so 2 years into our ordinance, we're seeing mechanical demolition and deconstruction start to be comparative in price. And so, 9% of the demo permits were like, I'm going to go ahead and do deconstruction because that's a way better thing, and the neighbors aren't going to be mad at me, and it's relatively cost comparative. So that's a really key thing there. And also in middle 2018, some additional requirements went into place for demolition, mechanical demolition, that ended up adding cost. It really didn't add cost to deconstruction, but it added cost to mechanical demolition. So while we were seeing the cost of deconstruction go down over those 2 years, mechanical demolition costs were going up. And anyway, the voluntary is, I think, intriguing to me. And then 2020 is when we raised the year built to 1940, and then we're capturing right around 2/3. So that was expected. Our stakeholder concerns. So I heard a little bit about this this morning with when Christiana was speaking. We really had 3 groups of stakeholders. There were developers, there were the deconstructionists, and then there were the neighborhoods. And each had concerns about a required deconstruction, a requirement for deconstruction. And I'll just kind of quickly go through this. So the developers were concerned about cost, and that came up this morning. They're also concerned about time. And so on the right there, that column, those are solutions. So for cost, we pointed to competition, that was ultimately going to lower the cost of deconstruction, and then also the availability of grants. So it was good to have that overlap. The developers were concerned about time, so we pointed to competition, that would help speed things up. Developers were also concerned about the availability of contractors, so we held contractor and workforce training to get other folks into the business. Also, I think that not everything should be salvaged, and we agree with that. And so we have exemptions in our code language for houses that and they wanted to avoid greenwashing, so where a demo contractor might come in and say, oh, we're gonna deconstruct this and we're gonna recycle everything. Well, what they meant was they're gonna smash it and take it to a recovery facility where a little bit of material might get recycled. So there was kind of a lot of misinformation. So let's go with certified deconstruction contractors where they're trained, certified to do this work, and then we can ensure that they're going to maximize salvage and actually get materials saved. The developers and deconstructionists were concerned about flooding the market, and I talked a little bit about this a second ago. We did not want to require deconstruction for everything because that would kind of overwhelm the market and the contractors that were doing the work. So that year built threshold is kind of our throttle. And then deconstructionists were also concerned about workforce and hiring, so we had a workforce training in March of 2017. And this is one of the slides I threw in at the last minute because it sounded like there was concern from builders that deconstruction takes longer and there's tight timelines involved with development, and having to spend 2 or 3 weeks taking down a house versus a day or two with mechanical demolition just adds to the holding costs or carrying costs of a development. And we had heard this anecdotally, and then we heard it again when we went back for our second ordinance to expand the requirement to 1940. And I was like, boy, I really don't see this happening in the real world. I see houses come down, either deconstruction or mechanically demolished, and then the site sits vacant for a while. So if in the eyes of a builder, a developer, they're saying, we get our demo permit, we want to be able to take down that structure in a day or two, and then we want to final that demo permit, and then we want to break ground on our new project. So if that were the case, so that's what we're hearing. And this is a complicated graph, but that top row is mechanical demolition, and then below it is deconstruction. So these are the actual timelines of a year's worth of permit data. And if we look at mechanical demolition, it takes about 63 days to get that permit. So we've got the 35-day delay, and then there was additional time on there because they didn't have enough information, and there were check sheets that went back and forth. Finally, it's issued on day 63, so this is average. From the time they got their demo permit to the time it was finalized, when they called in for final inspection, it was average of 59 days. So yeah, it probably took a couple of days, but obviously they weren't in a hurry to call in for that final inspection. But they did, and then the lot sits vacant for another 45 days before either they break ground on the new project, so let's say a new house, new couple of houses, or they get their land use review approved. So let's say they're subdividing the land. Now they still have to deal with the permits for the new house. So I think kind of the myth is that these projects are in super tight timelines, but we don't see that in the actual permit data. And Nantucket could totally look at their demo permit data and what follows on the site and see how this looks. So when we compare it to deconstruction, it took 59 days on average to get that permit reviewed and approved. So less time. All right, so we're already saving some time. Removal of the structure from the time they got their permit to when they closed it out was 80 days, so it's longer. That's kind of expected. But then it still sits vacant for 23 days before new development happens or their land use review was approved. And that's, all that I can see is when they picked up their permit. So it's possible that these projects, they got their permit, but they waited another 2 weeks or a month before they ever broke ground. But so the point of this graph is to show you if we're talking about speed and holding costs, deconstruction is actually the way to go. You break ground on your project 5 days sooner than you did on a mechanical demolition permit, and we could have a whole nother webinar on why that is, but that's the facts. So key components to our ordinance for me, are really the year built threshold, because you can dial that in for whatever works for your community. So for us, 1916 was a good starting point, and then moving it to 1940 was feasible when we looked at it 3 or 4 years later. And then reliance on certified deconstruction contractors. So we had 2 whole house deconstruction contractors before the ordinance, and we knew we needed more if we were going to require all of these. But they needed to know what they were doing. It needed to be safe. They needed to be trained in how to effectively remove the building, how to minimize damage on materials so that they would be valuable, and know what markets existed for materials. We require a 3-day training, an online exam, and then a skills assessment where they demonstrate that they can actually do certain things like remove flooring without damaging the tongue and groove, and windows without smashing them. And then currently we also require lead-based paint certification and asbestos inspector credential at a minimum, because we see almost on all of these, even when they've been abated for asbestos, they find hidden asbestos behind a wall, under a cabinet where there's some flooring that wasn't pulled up. So they're at least knowledge of suspect material helps with the crew. It helps get that material safely out, so anything that does go into a drop box doesn't end up on a sort line exposing workers to hazardous materials. Over the past, October 31st, Halloween of this year, will be the 5-year anniversary of our ordinance. So it's a great milestone. To date, and this might be a little bit old, but we've had over 350 house deconstructions, and that translates to about 3.5 million pounds of lumber, so just lumber, recovered for reuse. And that's a majority of what gets salvaged in these houses, because it's that old growth lumber and there's a market for it. To a lesser extent, windows, just because of energy efficiency. There's oftentimes asbestos in the old glazing, so not all the windows end up getting salvaged. And then for each house, on average, it's about 4,000 board feet of lumber that is salvaged and put back into the market. And because we know the weight of that lumber, and we know what the carbon benefits are of reusing that versus either burning it for energy recovery or landfilling it, when we compare deconstruction to demolition, there's a net benefit per house of 7.6 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And if we were to compare that to cars off the road for a year, it'd be 578 cars off the road. And then a lot of jurisdictions talk about banning plastic straws and plastic lids and plastic bags, and that's all good. But it would take 5.4 million plastic straws to equal the benefit of deconstructing one house versus mechanically demolishing it. That's a lot of straws. Other benefits and outcomes, and I think this is important for this group, is we are preserving materials. We're not preserving the house. We're not moving it, although that would be keeping it there would be the best. Moving it would be the second best, but third best is deconstruction. So we're saving some of that built history, the craftsmanship that went into building these houses, the materials, and that old growth lumber that is, you can't find those forests. They're few and far between. I think there's less than 10%. That middle picture there is a garbage burner. I think somebody sold that and uses it like as an outdoor fireplace, but it was a way to heat water in this old house that's there on the right. There's economic benefits, so it takes more people to deconstruct a house than it does to mechanically demolish, so that's more jobs. Then there's the fabrication of that material into things like furniture, and then the retail aspect of selling the wood as a raw material or something that has added value like furniture. Our workforce today is about 35% people of color and 16% women, so that's higher than the average in other construction sectors. The cost of deconstruction has come down while the cost to mechanically demolish has gone up. The coming down for deconstruction is really related to contractors offering additional services. So there are some deconstruction contractors that can do the asbestos abatement, then they can come in and deconstruct the house, and then they have access to heavy equipment that they can clear the foundation. So they're able to provide a consolidated bid for all those components that are usually required with a deconstruction, and house those and save some costs and pass those on to the client. The other key thing that's happened with bringing the cost down is several of our deconstruction contractors have opened up their own salvage yards, so they're able to sell their material at retail prices and not sell it at wholesale to another company or donating it and maybe getting a tax write-off. And so today it's comparable, and that's great. And then I added that holding costs are not impacted because it actually, you break ground on your new project quicker with deconstruction, as it turns out. Today we've got 15 certified deconstruction contractors. We started with 2. We've got 2 new salvage retail stores, so those 2 of those contractors that started because of the ordinance pretty quickly opened up their own retail stores. And then product development and research, so we're seeing this material, primarily wood, being used to design and build furniture. It's getting remilled into siding and wall cladding. There's been some research and a little bit of fabrication on creating cross-laminated timber panels using salvaged wood. So those pictures there in the middle are actual panels that were used from deconstructed houses in Portland. So from 3 different retailers, those ended up in panels that were tested at Oregon State University. And then grant awards and support. So we obviously had our grants on the front end of this, but our regional government and state government have been really supportive of advancing deconstruction and helping support this industry. So they've provided money for portable sawmills and boom trucks and training where we focused on people of color and women and getting them into the workforce. And then that's just ongoing. So this is just a little bit of eye candy. This is one of the new retail stores that opened up. They actually recently just moved and expanded to a larger facility. But that picture on the right there is kind of a little bar top that they built. There's 7 panels there with different materials, and each one of those panels represents the first 7 houses that they deconstructed under the ordinance. And this is another salvage yard, so this is Goodwood. They do deconstruction and they have the retail component. And they're adding value, cleaning up the lumber, planing it or resawing it, and they've done a lot of great work. This is Salvage Work, so they were around prior to the ordinance, and kind of their angle was they kiln dry all of their material, so it gets rid of any bugs and has a consistent moisture rate, so you don't have to worry about putting something in a commercial installation and then it shrinking and exposing gaps and stuff like that. And this is some of the material that they sell. So they call it the WOW wall. It's I think that stands for without work, that you can pretty much, it's all just ready to go and put on your walls as a cladding. And then they also do furniture, primarily out of 2x4s. 2x4s are harder to market and move, so they use that in-house to build their own furniture, and they've created some ways to kind of book match the edges where they wrap the edges with the material, and so it ends up looking thicker than a 2x4, but you can't really tell because the grain patterns matched up. So we're also trying to drive demand. What can we do? We've been primarily in the business of supply, so we require deconstruction. These houses have to come down, material has to be salvaged, but we don't really get into what happens with the material after that. And so we recently put into effect a zoning code incentive. It's a point-based system, and you get additional points if you used FSC recycled, which is that translates to salvage wood. Salvage wood is 100% recycled. And then we are working with our city procurements to get this product that you see there on the bottom. This is plywood that came off of construction sites that basically went into a drop box and its pathway was going to result in burning for energy recovery. Instead, it's rescued, it's resawn, it's cross-laminated, and it can be manufactured in 3/4 inch panels up to 1.5 inches, and it makes for great tabletops, wall cladding, signage. So we've worked with this local company to put this into a new building that the city's building that will hopefully eventually occupy for our bureau's offices. But that material on the right there is going to be some tabletops and lounge tops and benches in our new facility. So how can we use city procurements to leverage and help support the market? And then I mentioned this in the Q&A or chat with the last session, but we had a building code change for the state that allows salvaged wood or used lumber to be used in new construction in structural applications. And the way that's worded is the wood is presumed to have a grade of X, and structurally that's what it can handle. So it doesn't have to just be decorative. It can be structural now. And then Washington recently made a change to their code, which allows the same thing in both residential and commercial applications. And these are just some of the things that have been built out of this material. So, rustic tabletops, end tables, sliding barn-style doors. One of those pictures in the upper right there is a tiny house, a sleeping pod that we built with our local nonprofit out of almost exclusively salvaged materials, and that was donated to a local village. Art, pre-pandemic, it was hard to go into a new bar or coffee shop and not see this material showcased. It's ever present in tabletops, wall cladding. That has changed a little bit with the pandemic. So the demand for that from the commercial application side has gone down. From the residential application side, it's gone up because people are spending more time at home and they want to do something with their home environment. And I'll finish with this one. So Portland, as far as I know, was the first city in the country, in North America, to require deconstruction, to have a deconstruction ordinance. And that was 5 years ago. And since then, and Nantucket included, I've added you to this list, these are all the cities that are actively pursuing either grants or ordinances or other incentives to advance deconstruction. And let's see, Palo Alto, Denver's getting real close. Vancouver, BC, and Victoria, BC, all have ordinances in place that require deconstruction for a subset of their demolitions. So anyway, that's our program, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Shawn. It's really inspiring and very interesting to hear. I think once we start thinking about the life cycle of a house and how, as you were talking about, sometimes houses do come down, and that's obviously, from a historic preservation standpoint, demolition is the last resort. But if we are seeing as many demolitions as we are, which I think Christiana mentioned, we had 305 demolitions approved since 2017. How many of those would have been good candidates for deconstruction will be probably the next step of digging into. So it's a lot to shift down. You mentioned one question I had while we wait for some other to put their questions in the chats, is you'd mentioned the cost of mechanical demolition going up, and what are some of the factors that led to that?
Yeah, great question. So back in 2018, so we'll rewind a little bit, our deconstruction ordinance was in full effect. A third of houses were being deconstructed, a third of houses were, had careful attention to lead-based paint and less dust, more opportunity for discovery of unabated hazmat. But that was only a third. And so neighborhood groups were, still experiencing 2/3 of mechanical demolitions, just blowing dust everywhere, and piles of debris and stuff leaving the site and going to their property. So that led to this whole other essential advisory group to recommend changes to mechanical demolition. And what resulted was today, for a mechanical demolition, if the house was built in 1978 or earlier, it's presumed to have lead-based paint on the exterior. And the exterior paint compared to the interior paint has higher concentrations of lead. So today, mechanical demolition permit, you have to hand remove all the exterior siding, windows, doors, trim, deck railings, anything that's non-structural and it's got paint on it. You have to hand remove, burrito wrap it in plastic, and place it into a lined dumpster. So now mechanical demolition has to have a crew go out and do that. That probably added $3,000 to $5,000 to their costs. Further, they have to now wet down the structure prior to, during active demolition, and then loading into a drop box or dumpster. So that also added labor, because now there's a operator in the excavator, and then you've got to have another person physically holding a hose or something spraying down the structure. So they just added another person to their crew. And then I don't know how much this adds, but the cost to tip that material at the transfer facility is based on weight, and you just soaked it with water, so your disposal cost just went up. I'm glad that has happened. Now we capture 2/3, so there's only a third of houses now that are mechanically demolished, but there's a lot less dust leaving those sites. There's not that additional benefit of discovering unabated hazmat. If that's under a cabinet, that is not going to get seen by the person in the excavator. That's just going to go into the pile. But anyway, that's why those mechanical demolition costs went up. And it helps level the playing field. I mean, really, when we talk about deconstruction perhaps having a higher cost than demolition, it's because demolition doesn't capture the true costs. What are the costs of that hazardous material and the loss of that embodied energy? Deconstruction starts to get at the real cost, the true cost of taking down a structure. And I'm sure that Nantucket, I'm sure somebody has taken down a house and they've built, a green, sustainable house. Well, what's the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
How did you start with prepping the site? Did you smash up that house? So it's, I think the view of green building needs to expand to include.
It's interesting because so every year we take out sponsored ads, for these conferences, and every year we get lots of comments from people who deny climate change. And somebody commented, well, the green cost of demolition, or what's the real cost of demolition? And they, commented something to the effect of what you were just saying, which is people build these new houses that they think are so green, yet they've taken down and thought, yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to say. Right. So it is just thinking holistically about that whole approach where, is it better to modify an existing structure than it is to take something completely down and have it, have solar and run on everything all electric? So, okay, a couple questions come in. Did Portland create the original deconstruction certificate program? And is the deconstruction certification for contractors something that is expensive for them to acquire? How long does it take to get certified? Is it something that could be taken online?
That's great. That's a great question. So we looked at developing our own curriculum and having our own trainers for our ordinance. And ultimately what we ended up doing was working with a national organization. At the time was called Building Materials Reuse Association. Today it's just called Build Reuse. And they had an off-the-shelf curriculum, master trainers, costs, exam, a written exam that's taken online. So we ended up using that, and that was great because it's a third party. It's not based out of Portland or anything, so we're not mucking the waters with me certifying people. I mean, I ultimately certify them based on results from training and skills assessment and written exams and such. But it's a 3-day training, and then for asbestos, it's another 3-day training. Lead is a 1-day training, and then skills assessment's an hour, and taking the exam is however long it takes you to do it. So, in theory, it could take a couple of weeks. In reality, I would say that most people kind of, most people that have gotten certified, they've got a day job. They want to just add this to their portfolio, so they're fitting it in when they can. So I would say realistically, it takes people about 6 months to check off all the boxes. The cost, the trainer that we use is actually up in Bellingham, Washington, and so some folks have gone up there for the training. Otherwise, he comes down to Portland pretty regularly, and if there's a couple of folks that want to get trained, he'll combine that into one effort. And so I don't get involved in the cost because that's all handled outside of the city. But I would say, between the asbestos, lead, and deconstruction training, maybe $1,500 or so, and then your time. And I've been interested in EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, playing some sort of role in a national curriculum. There's increasing interest at the national level. Managed retreat in communities like your own. If a house needs to come down, let's not smash it. Let's deconstruct it. And they already play a role in lead paint certification, so it wouldn't be a huge leap if they were to get involved with that. But that's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, had you said before that FEMA might one day be a source of funding for
right
as it relates to coastal resiliency?
Exactly.
Yeah. Another question that someone has is essentially you have an idea of what percentage of materials are being reused in houses, like reused to rebuild a house or repair a house versus being reused in a decorative way.
All right, can you repeat that one again?
Yeah, so of the materials that are rescued from a house, did you have an idea of what percentage is being used to repair houses versus being used in another way, like decorations or furniture?
Okay.
And then I guess I would add on to that too, because I know in our conversations, some of this material is going beyond Portland to other areas, right? Where there's
right. So I would say, and this is a little just kind of professional guess because I don't have data on it, but in terms of what's going to repair versus what's going to more decorative kind of commercial applications, I'd say maybe 10% to repair, and most of that's going to be coming out of our local nonprofit called the Rebuilding Center, and so their mission is to provide affordable building materials to folks that can't afford expensive building materials. And they're a big operation. I think they're one of the biggest reuse retailers in the country, and they routinely get folks that come in and say, "Hey, my kid smashed our hollow core door in my apartment, and I'm going to lose my security deposit. Do you have something that's similar?" And sure enough, they do, and that gets put into that house. In terms of the amount salvaged on these houses, so we track the weight of the wood only, and so there's clawfoot tubs and fixtures and stuff like that we don't track the weight of, but from looking at just what's salvaged for reuse from a lumber standpoint, it's around 25% of the weight of the house. So if we were to take the house off the foundation, put it on a giant scale, a quarter of it's going to be wood that gets salvaged for retail. So it's not going to the landfill. It's not getting burned. A lot of the material, I think that number would have been higher several years ago, but increased scrutiny concern around lead-based paint. So really siding is not getting salvaged. Windows and doors, similar concerns. And then, by law, whatever goes into the drop box can't go directly to a landfill. It has to go to a recovery facility for sorting of recyclables. And so imagine if you were working on a sorting line and you've got all this material coming through from, first half of the day is from a deconstruction project, second half of the day is from a mechanical demolition. That deconstruction is going to be a lot of larger materials that are easily identified. They go into the wood box versus the stuff that's coming off the demolition sites, all pulverized and mixed. What they do with that is they further grind it up and pulverize it, and it becomes this, it's called alternative daily cover, and it's what goes on top of the landfill. And some people consider that recycling. I don't. Whether it's on top of the landfill or in the landfill, it's landfill. But anyway, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Shawn, for reporting. I love that. I'm Shawn Wood, and I'm sure. That's a great line. Thanks for your presentation, and we'll be hearing from Stephanie Phillips from San Antonio next.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Shawn.